In our final video on this section here, where we've covered what is a computer server, what is Linux, and now we'll be covering what is Ubuntu, we're going to talk about what a Linux distribution is, or a Linux flavor or variety of Linux. I told you in the last video that Linux is an open source project, so anyone can read the source code for Linux and modify it and redistribute it. Now, on a basic level, this comes down to what's called the Linux kernel. That's K-E-R-N-E-L, the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is going to be the core or the heart of the operating system itself. Anyone can view that source code and anyone can modify it and redistribute it, and then anyone is free to build whatever they like around it. So it's an open source project. So what's happened is many different people, different groups, lots of different guys and gals have taken the Linux kernel, they've modified it, or they've created these structures around it, and they've created their own flavor or variety of Linux. Now you experience this even with something like Windows, although Windows is managed by one company, Microsoft. It's not an open source project, so you can't just view Windows source code and modify it however you would like to and redistribute it. But with Linux you can do that. So stopping for just a moment on Windows, the different varieties or distributions of Windows would be Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows 2000, Windows ME, Windows XP, Windows 7. I just noticed how I skipped over Vista there for good reason. Windows 7 and now Windows 8. So the different distributions would be 95, 98, XP, 7, and 8, things like that. But they're all Windows, okay? So in the same way, Ubuntu is Linux, and it will always be Linux, but it's a particular distribution of Linux. It's a particular flavor or variety of Linux. Now, interestingly, Ubuntu, and that is the proper pronunciation, it's not Ubuntu, it's not Ubuntu or anything else, it is Ubuntu. Ubuntu Linux is actually based on another variety of Linux called Debian. So some guys and gals got together and created Debian off of the Linux kernel, that core or that heart. You could also think of it like a foundation, if you think of it like building a home. So the Linux kernel is going to be that foundation. And then you can build whatever house you want. You could take the same foundation on 3 lots, and 3 different people could build very different houses on that same foundation. That's what's being done with Linux. The Linux kernel is that foundation, okay? But very different distributions and varieties of Linux can be built on the Linux kernel. So the kernel is the core, the foundation, or the heart, and then the distribution is going to be built around it. It's the body or it's the structure of the house that you're building on top of the foundation. Now, Ubuntu was originally based on Debian, like I was saying, and so Debian was a structure that somebody built on top, or some people built on top of the Linux kernel. Then a group came along and said, we really like Debian Linux, but we want to improve it a little bit. And they were free to improve it because it's an open source project. So they took Debian Linux, Debian being the distribution, Linux being that core, okay, that kernel, and they built Ubuntu. Ubuntu is really growing in popularity, and I think that's because it's being properly managed as an open source operating system. You can download Ubuntu completely for free. You can view the source code and modify the source code. That is what is so great about an open source project. So that, the final thing I'll say about this, is you not only have Ubuntu, which is based on Debian, which is based on the Linux kernel, but you'll also find varieties such as Lubuntu, Xubuntu, Kubuntu. Those are all derivatives of Ubuntu. So you have the Linux kernel, the foundation, and then you had some people come up with Debian, and then you had some people modify Debian to make Ubuntu, and then you still have people today modifying Ubuntu to make all of these different varieties as well. It's a really interesting phenomenon with the open source movement. And there are a lot of strong advocates of the movement. I think it's a terrific idea. People are incentivized merely by innovation and by creating something cool. And I think you'll see as we dive into Ubuntu, they've definitely created something very, very cool. So let's end all of this talking about what it is and where it comes from. And let's get ready to dig into actually installing Ubuntu, and let's get our fingertips dirty, typing some stuff in there and doing some things with Ubuntu server. Does that sound good? All right, let's get started.